bring people together, recognize where they are in their community as far as their dedication, their commitment, and their focus towards peacemaking and creating cultures of nonviolence. And so we're all remembering and relearning, reassessing our understanding of the principles of nonviolence. And Joan Wages has helped over the last few months bring out some of the basic information from Martin Luther King's and Gandhian principles of nonviolence that we can remind one another, those of us who have already studied in that practice, but also those who have not, and for the youth and friends and family that are not aware of the power that comes from the nonviolence through our communication skills, from the personal, family, the community, and how that also includes the resistance to and the things that are intolerant and oppressive in our community that put any type of person in a dehumanizing position. So over the summer, a number of groups have been forming, new relationships have been forming, and identification that our language across the community is doesn't always fit each other's understanding of what our ultimate goal is together. And so identifying what our language barriers might be is one of the openings that have been happening this summer. And we can break it down into specific issues of gun violence or oppression or racism or any other issues that we're dealing with, environmental destruction. And those are all important sectors of the work that needs to be done. But at the same time, if we could overlay that with the idea of these circular diagrams here in the room of the different sectors of society that we individually represent as well, and to recognize that we each are an individual, valuable role, or person, as far as our role in the whole movement for creating a nonviolence and a new norm of peace in the community. And so if we can find these ways of stimulating other people to see where they fit in that puzzle, where do we fit in the process of environmental awareness, in a thriving economy, in our food production and safety, in our governance, and in our communication skills, that we each are a part of that puzzle and helping one another come to that realization of that we are all in this together and finding common ways of sharing. And so after today, each day at the Martin Luther King Bridge, one of the aspects of the personal nonviolence practice is finding a way, finding your spiritual practice, your way of silence, way of setting intention. And so at the Martin Luther King Bridge at noon each day, we're going to be reading a passage and then walking for about 15 minutes across the bridge, activating that intention, activating the city of Roanoke perhaps, with our thoughts and our energy. So that's every day. And on Tuesday, Joy Truskowski wanted to do the Ask Me project, Ask Me Anything project, which has been done in different communities where a person or persons hold up different signs identifying themselves as whoever they are, and then to ask me anything. So maybe I am a Muslim, ask me anything. I am a Christian, ask me anything. I'm a peace activist or a pastor. It could be whatever, however you might want to identify yourself that you think that the community might have some questions about, or certain people might have questions about that they've not yet opened up the courage and the tolerance to have peaceful, nonviolent conversations. And on Thursday, the Walks of Intentions continue. I'm skipping Wednesday, which I didn't mean to skip. The Witness Against Torture campaign will be another speaking engagement similar to this one tonight, but at the Quaker Friends Meeting House. And that's at 6:30.
Is that Wednesday?
That's Wednesday.
Wednesday night, yes. And then on Friday, we're going to have a drum circle at Lick Run Farm, so connecting back to that food and the environmental aspect of peace work. And so that's on 10th Street, 1626, across from the Brown Robinson Park there, near Lake Run Creek. So it's in between Orange Avenue and Williamson Road. And then Saturday is a collaboration with a group called the Agape Performing Arts Center, a new nonprofit for providing performing arts, dance, theater, vocals for youth who are normally perhaps not available or able to take such classes. So the underserved youth. And when we found out, and Bernadette told me that they were having a performance and festival in Villa Heights Park the same day that some of us with Plowshare Peace Center were working on a Universal Day of Peace Festival on this side of town, we thought, well, now's the time to join together. And so we're going to be over at Villa Heights Park, which is off of Lafayette Street. And if you're going down Orange Avenue from downtown west, it merges into Melrose, and you've got 24th Street, Goodwill, and Lafayette is the second light, and it goes uphill over to Hirschberger. Everybody familiar, sort of? So off of Lafayette, 3 blocks left on Clifton. So we'll have some signs. We definitely want to encourage people to make the effort to come to a different park, one of the older parks in Roanoke, and mix it up with some people perhaps we haven't actually sung and danced and performed with. And we'll be bringing peace and justice information and children's activities. The theme being around weaving unity. So there'll be a large adult weaving project out in the field near the stage events, and then other smaller weaving projects like the example here for children in the children's area, and try to connect some of those ideas of weaving unity and the diversity, celebrating the diversity amongst us all. So that was more than I meant to say. Joe, what else do we need to go into? And we have this list of events in the back. If you don't have that already.
Also the Facebook page.
And the Facebook page is called Peace Week Roanoke.
2016.
2016?
Yes, I think so.
Yes.
I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you to all the people that are here who are engaged in the partnership to bring Peace Week into fruition in Roanoke. There's many of you here tonight, and I really appreciate it. Our partners include Plowshare Peace Center, Agape Performing Arts Center, Your Vote, Your Voice, Roanoke Catholic Worker, and Points of Diversity. Did I miss it? And I'm going to introduce Ralph with, I'm just going to tell you how I met him and then let him introduce himself. So in 2010, the summer of 2010, what was it called? There was a big celebration down in Knoxville. People came from across the country for the Nuclear Free Futures. What is that what it was called? Okay. So it was a 30-year celebration of work to end the nuclear system, I guess you'd say, in our country. And so there was a lot of education that went on there, and then we all got together and had direct action at the Oak Ridge nuclear weapons plant. And it was my first real engagement in something that was such a big direct action type of event. I was one of several who blocked the gate. We had several of us were arrested and taken to the center, and then other people went onto the property and risked arrest too. So, and that's the first time I met Ralph, and I've been in touch with him ever since. I keep going back. It's just it's awesome to go down there and engage with the community that's been working on this for years, and their dedication is inspiring to me. Every time I go, I feel fed by that, and I really appreciate all of the work that you're doing there. Welcome, and thanks also to the Unitarian Universalist Church congregation for allowing us to be here tonight.
Thank you, Joan. And I was going to start with a question, but Joan already answered it. I was sort of wondering who all was represented here in the room, but that's a wonderful list of people who are working together to make this week happen. I congratulate you on that. I think that's a great thing. I'm going to rely on my papers tonight as a disciplinary measure for myself. Otherwise, I could talk for a long, long time. And I do appreciate the invitation from Jonah to come and talk with you all. It's nice. I think what she said is the way we like to think of ourselves in Oak Ridge as a good, strong, vital peace community because we've been working together so long. It's nice to come out and meet with other communities and see people who've also been in this struggle for a long time, and that's encouraging to me to get to go back home and say, oh, there are really cool people in Roanoke who are doing this as well. So my name is Ralph Hutchison. I work for the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance. I've been working for them for 20-some years now, and we work to stop nuclear weapons production in Oak Ridge, and I'll talk about that a little bit tonight near the end of my talk. But our organization also works to create the way we describe it is to create a culture of nonviolence in our community, in the Knoxville, Oak Ridge, East Tennessee area. And that was a conscious decision made by our board of directors as part of a strategic planning process. Not only because, well, I talk about that a little bit here, but it also sort of grounded the work that we were already doing, working like with the Martin Luther King Jr. Commission to work on the annual commemorative events, and we do a pretty extravagant thing in Knoxville, and the parade that we have, and the community conversation that OREPA sponsors and stuff like that. So we had all these other things that we did because they were things we liked to do, and they were good things to do, and they didn't fit into stopping nuclear weapons production exactly. So when we talked about what is it we're doing, it is we're trying to build a nonviolent community. We're trying to strengthen that in our own area. So that was really nice to hear that you all are doing a whole Peace Week. I mentioned to somebody earlier when I saw the origami peace cranes on the table, we're celebrating the International Day of Peace in Knoxville next Saturday with Children's International Summer Villages, which is a youth peace organization, by holding an event called 1,000 Cranes. And we're going to fold 1,000 cranes on Saturday. The local bookstore is hosting us there to do it. And we're hoping that this is the first year we do 1,000 cranes, and we'll draw in some people, the Quaker meeting and some other people who've already said yes, they'll come and help, but maybe to build that as a broader community event. And now you all are sort of saying to me, well, that's great if you do that on one day, but you should have a whole week full of events. So now I gotta go back home and work some more. Thanks a lot for that. But I'm glad you're doing it. So I thought I would talk tonight for most of my talk about what it means to live in a culture of violence and what we should do about that. And then at the end, I'll talk some about the specific work that I do in Oak Ridge on nuclear weapons. A few years ago, when my friend Steve Leeper came to Knoxville to introduce to us the survivor of the Hiroshima bombing, the people who survived the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are called the Bakusha. And they travel around the world, fewer and fewer of them as the years go by, but they travel around the world in an incredibly courageous act. They relive over and over again the most horrific day any of us could imagine when the bomb was dropped. And they do it to say never again, never again. And so when Steve was the first non-Japanese person ever appointed to head the Hiroshima Peace Culture Museum. And he did it in order to broaden the international reach of the museum. And he brought some hibakusha with him to travel around the country. When he came to Oak Ridge, he said, we live in a culture of violence. And just as I was beginning to ponder, what does he mean by that? Exactly, he said, think about how we settle our differences as a nation. If you're doing something we don't like, or something we feel threatens us or one of our allies, we have diplomatic tools, we have economic tools, we can pass resolutions in the United Nations, but finally, if none of that works, we will kill you. That's how we get our way, ultimately. So Steve was right. If you think about popular video games, if you think about football, if you think about other forms of recreation, if you think about what we don't teach our kids in school, how many of us were taught about Gandhi or A.J. Muste? Very few hands. right? My friend Dan Zack, Washington Post reporter, just wrote a book called Almighty, in which he followed the Plowshare's action from Oak Ridge and spent a year writing this book about nuclear weapons. And when I asked him some interview questions, he said, "I spent 12 years in a Catholic school, and I never once heard the name Dorothy Day." One of the 3 people singled out by the Pope as apostles of nonviolence. But they're in a very narrow education system. He had never heard the name of one of the champions of what the co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. So we're all taught about Washington, Grant, Patton, Eisenhower. We know the names of the generals. We remember, yeah, I heard those, but Gandhi, A.J. Muste, not so much. 20 years ago, when we were planning a Women's Disarmament Day action in Oak Ridge, we had a theme called Breaking the Circle of Violence. It made a really nice graphic on the t-shirt that we had there. And as we were planning the day's program, we were talking about what the theme meant. Shelley Wascom said, "This might not be something we want to say in our media release, but really as long as we have nuclear weapons, it's okay to beat your wife." That's what it means to have a circle of violence. What goes around comes. Some of the most enduring and deeply embedded lessons that we have learned in our lives were taught to us without words, many of them before we could even understand words very well. As adults, we think about global conflicts, national defense, nuclear deterrence, but as children, at some point, it seeped into our heads that violence is okay, because people told us not to hit, but those same people cheered for soldiers in the streets. And what were soldiers trained to do first and foremost? Let's just say they spend a lot more time in the rifle range than they do learning how to build schools or health centers. So everyone would shudder at the thought that it would be okay to beat your wife or your husband or your children or your parents. It offends us to the core. But what about killing someone? I spend a lot of my time working on nuclear weapons issues, but OREPA, the group I work for, took on the mission of building a nonviolence community when we realized that if by some miracle all the nuclear weapons in the world were wiped off the face of the earth one weekend, on Monday morning our work still wouldn't be okay, everything wouldn't be okay. We would still be surrounded by violence that confounds our stated beliefs about morality and about humanity. So I want to talk about violence as it runs through our culture, and I'll save a little time at the end to talk about nuclear weapons, because while you are not noticing, our government has launched a new global nuclear arms race, and we're planning to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to build new bomb plants and new warheads and new bombers, new submarines. If you made a pyramid of violence, you could put nuclear weapons at the bottom, and you could also put nuclear weapons at the top. If my friend Shelley is right, if the commitment that we have made as a nation to be willing to threaten the entire planet, including ourselves, with annihilation, as insane as that is, that can be seen as the foundation on which all our other violence rests. And at the same time, since it does place the entire planet at risk, it is an existential threat. It represents the maximum violence, the ultimate, the very pinnacle. So nuclear weapons kind of frame this culture of violence. And I think we build our talk tonight as from the personal to the global. Take a moment just to think about the ways that violence permeates your life. How it has impacted you or rubbed up against you or your community. One Friday evening last fall, I stepped out of a restaurant on Market Square in Knoxville, downtown Knoxville, and I was transfixed by the beauty of the moment. It was perfect weather. It was warm with a slight breeze, and at the end of Market Square on a giant screen, there was a movie playing The Princess Bride. And in front of me were hundreds of folding chairs, all different colors, filled with kids and parents, and there were people sitting on blankets on the ground, and I thought how marvelous it is to live in Knoxville, Tennessee, where this kind of thing happens on a Saturday night in downtown. Just a lovely observation of the community that we were. And then a couple weeks ago, I got an email on my computer from the public library. It said, help us select the movies for this year when we have our movie night in the fall. And it had a link to a ballot, and there were 5 or 6 different categories, and it said each one tries to be family friendly, but parents should read the reviews. And I looked at the first item on the list was adventure movies. Every one of them was a movie with violence at its core. Not just peripheral, not just part of the dramatic arc, but bound to be the action part of the film. For several of them, it was virtually the entire film. And I noticed this week that they finished the voting and they're starting the series, and this is the adventure film. Star Wars: The Force Awakens. You can just see from the poster. Wow. Not wow because the library puts pulse-pounding violence on the big screen for children of all ages, family-friendly, as though it's normal, but also wow because the choices were so limited. Adventure could mean discovery, it could mean travel to new places, it could mean inventing things, but where are those films? Because we live in a culture that takes violence for granted. You can flash one split second of a naked body part and the film will get an R rating. But villains can be slain left and right, and it's just PG-13. Last weekend, some of you probably know this, the University of Tennessee's football team had its second game of the season against Virginia Tech. And I imagine the point of having the game in Bristol was to maximize the economic impact for each team. I don't know how the game was advertised around here, but in Knoxville it was the Battle of Bristol.
Bill.
It was not a game, it was not a contest, not an athletic event, not a competition. It was a battle. Complete with all the trappings of our battles. The green was saying, God bless America. And the day before the game, this headline in the Knoxville paper, the ROTC cadets are running the game ball from Neyland Stadium in Knoxville to the Battle of Bristol. Now, I grew up a big Pittsburgh Steelers fan in the years when the Pittsburgh Steelers strode large across the gridiron with Terry Bradshaw and Joe Green and Jack Ham and Jack Lambert, Franco Harris and John Stallworth and Lynn Swann. My favorite players in my childhood, though, were Gale Sayers and Bobby Hayes because they were finesse players. They relied on speed and agility to not get tackled. And if I was going to have any role in football, even in the neighborhood pickup games, it was not going to be knocking people down. It was going to be escaping. But now that football is all knocked down, the local TV stations in Knoxville anyway, and I've seen it in a couple of other parts of the country, they air special coverage on high school football nights. The late news is cut short to 10 or 12 minutes, and then we have Friday night hits. That's what we have in Knoxville. Oblivious to the fact of cerebral damage that is caused by those multiple impacts of Friday night hits. This is who we are. Some years ago, after seeing a particularly violent, vicious play with a player carted off the field, I found myself asking, how does watching football square with my commitment to nonviolence? Because nonviolence is something that I consciously try to integrate into my life. If you're going to be a disciple of nonviolence, you have to consciously try to integrate it into your life. It doesn't happen automatically in this culture. I was a person who went around doing trainings on consensus decision-making and conflict resolution. I was the guy who scooped spiders out of the bathtub with a yogurt container and took them outside to set them free. I stood on the corner every weekend to protest the latest war. And then on Sunday afternoon or Monday night, I just gave myself up to the spectacle of intentional pounding violence just for entertainment. So I quit. It's not as hard as you think. Sometimes the violence in our lives is so deeply ingrained that we don't notice it. This next part is not to preach vegetarianism, because that's not what I do, but to say as an example. I grew up eating meat every meal except breakfast. That's just what food was, and that's what a meal was. And it still is for my father. He hasn't had a meal if he didn't have some meat in it. I was not unaware of the violence that goes along with food preparation. I have vivid memories of Saturday mornings when we killed the chickens. My father and my uncle worked the hatchet. My cousins and I had to take the headless birds around the barn to the tub of scalding water, where my aunt would dip them to begin the defeathering process, and then we had to pluck them. And I remember that those mornings were terribly uncomfortable for me the whole time, because we did it early in the morning when there was cold dew on the ground in Pennsylvania, and we kids were not allowed to wear shoes because we couldn't get the messy. I hated having cold, wet feet. The slaughter of the birds I took for granted. It was amusing sometimes when they scampered away after they lost their heads. When I stopped eating meat, it wasn't because of the violence. It was because of the incredible nutritional inefficiency. Michael Harrington wrote a book called The Vast Majority. Even that wasn't trying to convert people to vegetarianism, but there was a page in which he said eating meat is like living on a block full of hungry people, and you have enough food to feed them all, but you instead decide to make one really delicious cake for yourself and your family. 7 pounds of grain makes 1 pound of beef. And I pondered that for a little bit, and then I was done with meat. For my daughters, who have never eaten meat, they are 21 and 18, the very idea of killing animals to eat them is baffling and horrible to them. It was never normal. So even though we're all vegetarians, we have very different views of meat eating. It was never imagined in them. They weren't taught to overlook the violence. They weren't taught to accept it as part of the natural order the way that I was. But turn that around. Once we stopped at a red light in Knoxville, and Emma, who was then 4 years old, asked us what were the words on the big sign across the street while we were sitting there at the intersection. And her sister, 2.5 years older, dispensed some wisdom. She said, "Oh, Emma says, I can't wait until I can read." And her sister says, "It's not all that great, Emma. Once you learn to read, you have to read everything you see, whether you want to or not." I had never thought that before, but I realized it's true. It is impossible not to read the words in front of you if they are in your language, right? So last Sunday, I'm walking across the parking lot at Kroger, and I see a car with one bumper sticker. Imagine you're 6 years old, 7, 8 years old. You've mastered the alphabet, the way letters go together. You've figured out what words mean. And you're quietly reading everything you see to yourself. And you see a car that has one bumper sticker. A lot of the things we learn just get impressed into us without anybody standing up and preaching them to us, right? What if instead of growing up thinking life is precious and deserving of our ultimate respect, the generation grows up and think that killing someone else is a punchline on a bumper sticker? That's what it means to live in a culture of violence. So my point is that violence fills our lives even in ways that we don't necessarily recognize, and often in ways that we don't examine. It's just the way it is. And part of that is because we don't get challenged very much. Maybe we don't challenge each other. We often don't challenge ourselves. The fact that schools don't have entire curriculum about Gandhi, who was in many of the polls taken back in 1999 declared the most important human being to live in the last century. The fact that we don't teach our children about nonviolence as a way to resolve conflicts, or about diplomatic successes, but we do have entire curriculums about wars and warriors. That's illuminating. Our immersion in violence is almost total, as much because of what is left out as because of what is put in. When I was in seminary, we had a pastoral counseling class to teach us what to say when parishioners came in with problems. And we went through this class. Basically, what I learned to say ultimately about it was, you probably need to see somebody who knows more than I do about counseling people with problems. But that was part of it, was learn when you're out of your depth. But to practice in this class, we formed little families within the class. And each week, the 4 of us in my family had to meet together for 4 hours, eat a meal and do stuff and make plans. And we sort of had to form a family. And then at some point in the semester, we would do practice runs. A family would come in, would present the issues that had developed in their family, and a student counselor would try to help them figure things out. The rest of us would sit around the room. It was kind of a fishbowl set up, and we would watch to learn and be able to debrief about this. So one week, the professor, Bill Arnold, said that, this was in Richmond, Virginia, by the way, said that we would learn conflict resolution. And this sounded important, so I paid attention while he wrote some stuff on the board. And then the family came in and sat down with the student. And the husband and the wife were arguing, and the son was caught in the middle. And we sat there and watched for about 10 or 12 minutes as things unfolded, and people got angry and said mean things to each other. And the poor student counselor was so helpless to do anything. He tried to be an empathic listener a lot, but yes, I see, or it just didn't cut it with where this family was. And finally, the professor, Bill, stepped in, and he said, "Do you mind if I try?" The student was relieved to get off the hot seat, and Bill sat down, and 4 minutes later, the husband and the wife were in tears, and most of us in the classroom were in tears. He had broken through the anger. He had identified the root of their problem, and he was beginning to put the pieces back together. And then he stopped and said, "Now let's debrief what just happened here." But he asked for thoughts, feedback, observations, and we were dumbstruck. We had seen a miracle, one that we knew we would never be able to perform. But finally somebody said, "How did you do that?" And he turned around and he looked at the board behind him where he had written at the beginning of the class 3 phrases, and he said, "That is the magic. What do you want?" You can ask either party, but they have to answer with an I statement that is positive. Not what do you not want, what do you don't want, what do you want? And then, to the other party, can you hear what he or she just said? Can you repeat it back to me? Make sure that you heard it right. Because usually when we're arguing, we're not listening to what the other person said, right? We're getting ready for our next part of the argument because we got to win. And then finally, can you do that? That was the magic. And I can tell you that it works in ways that nothing else does to resolve conflicts. People rarely get past what they don't want. I don't like it when he does that. I don't like it when he does it, unless they are directed. But with simple, gentle guidance, almost everybody can break through to an honest conversation. I want to be loved. And the resolution becomes clear when the other person says, "Yes, I can do that," or "No, I can't do that." But here's the thing. If there is such simple magic to resolve conflicts, maybe not every conflict that we have, but maybe a lot of them, if they don't get dug in deeper and deeper and deeper before we might try to talk about things with our partner or our friend if we knew there was a way out of the feelings that we're feeling, the conflict. If there is some simple magic to resolve the kind of conflict that will come to us throughout our lives, with our partners, with our colleagues, with our bosses at work, with our fellow students at school, with our children, with our parents, why aren't we taught this in school? Why do we learn the quadratic equation of the Pythagorean theorem and not how to meet each other's needs without screaming and scheming and manipulating and employing all manner of psychological abuse? Why aren't we taught how to make group decisions by consensus in high school? A process where everyone is heard, a process that seeks a solution where everybody's ideas get incorporated and everybody wins. We're not taught that in school. What are we taught? Robert's rules. You get a motion, you get a second, you have discussion, you vote, a bunch of people win, everybody else loses. Why aren't we taught the fundamental communication skills that relate to others with respect and place a value on listening as great as the value we usually and naturally place on being heard? I was in a meeting one time in which we had an outside trainer come in. It was a meeting of the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, which is a national network of peace activists. So at their very heart and soul, you would expect when you come into that room to find good, well-intentioned people. And I've been meeting with them for 30 years, and I know they are. So the trainer came in to talk about how people communicate. And a key piece of the workshop was about male dominance patterns of communication, which, because they're so common, it's not just men that use them. That afternoon, after the training, we were back in our regular work group, and we were talking about the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which was a subject that didn't fascinate me as much as it did and still does, the policy wonks in Washington, D.C. And I slid my chair back a little bit, and I started to observe the conversation around our table and take some notes. And at the end of the 30-minute session, here's what I had seen. This was a group of progressive-minded peace activists who had just been through a training. Every single interruption was by a male, never a female. The group was evenly split between men and women. And more than 90% of the time, those men interrupted women, not other men. I was flabbergasted. I mean, if I hadn't been keeping score, I would not have believed it was quite that bad, but it was. There are ways to communicate more respectfully. There are things that we can do when we talk together to make sure that that happens. But we don't get taught those things in school. And the only way they're going to happen, even if we hear them in a training, is if we practice the skills until they become part of how we operate. And it bleeds over into our personal lives. That we just learn to talk to each other and listen with respect. The fact that we're not conscious about educating ourselves and our children about the most fundamental nonviolent skills tells us we live in a culture of violence. So, this week, as you go about all these activities, wonderful activities that I was hearing about, think about, explore how nonviolence works in our lives and our community. How is our culture influencing us, and what nonviolence tools are out there that we don't have in our toolbox yet, and how can we add them to our toolbox? Now, I promised you earlier that I would talk about violence also on a global scale. I'm jumping over some critically important things, and I hope to heaven you're talking about in your community, community-wide issues like economic violence and racial violence and physical assault, and Black Lives Matter and the Cradle to Prison Pipeline, and even Colin Kaepernick, maybe. But it's important to note that it's all connected. Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Right? And he noted that our destinies, even our freedoms, are inextricably linked. Inextricably linked. You can't separate out any one issue and say, I'm good on this, the rest is up to somebody else to worry about. At the same time, you can't do everything. You can't do everything, so you have to make some choices. But those choices recognize that we're all in the same struggle, and other issues are also just as important as my issue. Okay, not my issue, but all the other issues are. A couple of years ago, I was talking to the Catholic Committee in Appalachia, and I realized that for people who are up against the urgent needs of the poor in their community, nuclear weapons seemed like a pretty remote issue. But this was the connection that I realized. Whatever work you're doing to create the world we want to live in, it takes resources. And as long as we're spending billions and billions of dollars building nuclear weapons in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, we don't have money to build adequate schools, or housing for the homeless, or provide health insurance for the uninsured, or do any of the other things that would really provide security for the people who live in this country. So just as an aside, a reminder of how far away the ideas, how foreign the idea of nonviolence is in our larger community. I read an article in the Washington Post about the long snapper for the Washington football team, who started a tweet conversation about Colin Kaepernick's protest. And it was a really nice article, marked by real intelligence and sanity. And the Washington player fielded tweets and refused to be baited or frustrated. He got one from a person who complained that Kaepernick should have tried to find some other way to make his point, like volunteering with a community group or talking to an elected official or doing a peaceful protest. And the Washington Center tweeted back, like, take a knee during the national anthem. It reminded me of a day in Anderson County after a bunch of people got arrested for blocking the entrance to the bomb plant in Oak Ridge. I don't think it was your day, Joan, but it was a very similar kind of a day. Before the action, the state's attorney general had announced that he was not going to prosecute people for blocking the bomb plant in Oak Ridge, a misdemeanor obstructing the highway. He said, we're not going to spend our state resources on these prosecutions. If the federal government wants to prosecute these people, let them go at it. So he was basically calling our bluff. It's a brilliant strategy if you want to disarm nonviolent activists. Just let them do it. But don't tell that outside this room, please. So when we got to the site, 60-some people sat down on the ground and they linked their arms. They snaked across the highway there, and they blocked all the lanes into the plant. And half an hour passed, and an hour passed, and the chief of police, who I'd known for years, came over to me and said, we're not making any arrests here today because the Attorney General won't prosecute. And I said, that's up to you. They were happy to block the road. You should know that several of them have bottles, and others are wearing Depends, and they've already arranged for food to come in during the night. So you're not going to make arrests tonight. It was like Sunday afternoon. But at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, 3,000 cars are going to come down this road and want to turn into that bomb plant. And you're going to need Plan B. Well, it didn't turn out that way, because after a couple of hours, the demonstrators decided they wanted to press their issue. And they went through a consensus process. And then they got up and they linked arm in arm. And they started walking the quarter mile away from the bomb plant back to the main traffic intersection in the city of Oak Ridge. And minutes later, just as they were rounding the bend, we saw a stream of state police cars pour out of the bomb plant and cut across the side road and head them off. And after a brief negotiation, and here the police were frustrated because there was no leader in the group to make decisions. The chief turns around and looks and says, "What's this consensus?" But the demonstrators gathered in a circle, talked it over, and turned around and headed toward the intersection, and they were arrested. So in court, the judge chides the Attorney General, who had to arrest them after all. And then he turns to the demonstrators and he says, you know, you people can go out there to the bomb plant where no one can see you and protest all you want to, all day and all night, I don't care. But you cannot close the road that leads to McDonald's and Walmart. That's not going to happen. So I think the powers that be in this country are like that judge. They want to keep nuclear weapons off the radar screen. They're fine if Colin Kaepernick finds some way to protest that nobody notices. That'd be all right. Even if the fundamental message of his protest is at the very heart of that speech that Martin Luther King Jr. made in Washington, D.C. 53 years ago. Martin Luther King Jr., the only individual in this country we honor with his own national holiday, called the country out for its failure to fulfill its promissory note. And that's exactly, explicitly what Kaepernick said when he was asked why he did his action. A holiday for King, he's dead of course, burn the jersey of the quarterback. They're fine if we sequester ourselves in our work and in our issues and compete with each other for money and media and volunteers. We get so busy doing our work that we don't notice the connections that run through all of our struggles. So in that spirit, it's my job to tell you what's going on with nuclear weapons, where trillions of dollars will be spent from our common treasury over the next 30 years. And I'll start by showing you some headlines that you have not read recently. But every one of them is true. They've just not been in any of these papers. What's going on is that we have started a new global nuclear arms race, and by we I mean the United States of America. And to narrow it down even further, I'll tell you that the epicenter of the new global nuclear arms race is just a few hours southwest of here, where I came from, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, at the Y12 Nuclear Weapons Complex, where they are right now Today, well, they take Sunday off. Tomorrow, building thermonuclear cores for the W-76 Modification 1 warhead. Did you know your government is busy building weapons of mass destruction? The sad truth is that most people in this country, outside of those of us who are in the peace movement and activists and paying attention to this kind of stuff, know a lot more about Iran's nuclear program or North Korea's nuclear program, or they think they do, because that's all the media talks about. And even then, the media doesn't tell you what I think is a really crucial detail. Neither Iran nor North Korea is doing or even thinking about doing anything we have not already done thousands of times. Headlines last week, North Korea conducted their 5th nuclear test. President Obama condemned it in the strongest possible terms. Even China joined in condemning North Korea. Did you notice any articles mentioning that the United States has conducted 1,054 nuclear tests? North Korea was on its 5th. My friend Jackie Cabasso describes this current effort by the nuclear weapons states to stop other countries as pulling up the ladder. It's a very particularly demonic kind of folly, and it is a folly because why would they? So here are the 4 key things that you should know about nuclear weapons today, if you care about having a world for the next generation to inherit. The danger of a nuclear catastrophe is greater today, right now, than at almost any time in our history. And that's not my assessment as a peace activist. This is what we're hearing now from Admiral William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, Henry Kissinger, the architect of the Vietnam War. General George Lee Butler was the head of the U.S. Strategic Air Command and NATO nuclear forces. General James Cartwright, George Shultz, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, is up there. In an article for the Yale Divinity School, George Shultz said, "The goal of achieving a world free of nuclear weapons is of transcendent importance. So far as the proliferation of nuclear weapons and their potential use is concerned, we are at a tipping point. The danger is all too real. The simple continuation of present practice with regard to nuclear weapons is leading in the wrong direction." Since he said that, there has been a change. The United States has doubled down on our nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, the tipping point balance is swinging. Most people in the millennial generation don't have much of a concept of what nuclear catastrophe would look like. If you weren't paying attention and aware in 1983, which was about the last time the question of total nuclear annihilation galvanized the attention of this country, when the movie The Day After was shown on ABC TV. And I just happened to see this last week some reference to that. It is still the most watched television movie ever, The Day After. The country has not been paying attention to nuclear weapons. Now, that might change, even with Eric Schlosser's Command and Control movie, which is playing at select locations around the country now, but will eventually be on PBS's American Experience. Tonight, 60 Minutes, right now, 60 Minutes is doing the first of a 2-part series on our preparations for nuclear war. And they're going inside the silos and into the submarines to look at the people who would actually turn the switches and punch in the launch codes. So that may catch people's attention. I don't know whether it will or not. But most people hear about the devastation we might expect if we don't rein in global climate change, which is very true and very important. But as I have been saying for several years with my colleagues, what climate change will do in 30 years, nuclear weapons can do in 1 afternoon. So here's the next thing you need to know. The United States is planning to spend $1 trillion over the next 30 years to modernize, they call it modernize, every part of the nuclear weapons enterprise. That's what they call it. Our president, who talks a good game, he announced his commitment to a world free of nuclear weapons 7 years ago. And since then, spending for nuclear weapons has increased every year. Not because Congress upped his budget. His budget increased spending for nuclear weapons every year. It is higher than it has ever been right now. And our nuclear stockpile, the number of weapons we have, is holding steady at about 5,000 warheads. We have 1,500 deployed around the world on hair trigger alert. Now, $1 trillion over the next 30 years is a big number. It's hard to wrap your mind around that. So think of it like this. $4 million per hour. Every hour, 30 years.
Ooh.
What they want to do is build new bomb plants to replace the Manhattan Project facilities, build new bombs and warheads, build new missiles, build new bombers, build new submarines and jets, literally every single part of the nuclear program. If you aren't on the email lists that I'm on, you likely haven't heard very much about this, but I promise you Russia knows all about it, and China knows about it, and they're ramping up their nuclear programs as well. You can't read the small print, but if you see those circles over on the upper left-hand side there, at the top is U.S. spending on modernization, and underneath it, comparatively, is Russia, China, and France. So you can see who's leading the global nuclear arms race. Not just in the amount of money we spent, but we were the first ones to do it. We're pushing this race to happen. Which brings me back to my backyard, the Y12 complex in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is ground zero for nuclear modernization. And I say that because the plans to build a new bomb plant to manufacture thermonuclear cores for warheads and bombs. This new bomb plant is called the Uranium Processing Facility. Doesn't sound like a bomb plant, that's intentional. But its sole purpose will be to manufacture the thermonuclear cores for a nuclear weapon. That means the part of the bomb that does this is what we make in Oak Ridge. We have made this for every nuclear warhead in the U.S. stockpile ever. We're the only bomb plant in the country that has the capacity to manufacture components out of highly enriched uranium and lithium deuteride to make this massive explosion. The facility in which they built it, building 9212, in which they're doing this now, does not meet current environmental standards, and it is not seismically qualified, so they want to replace it with the UPF, the Uranium Processing Facility, and it will cost upwards of $15 billion to build. It's the bomb plant on which all the rest of the modernization depends. So far, the design of this UPF has cost taxpayers about $3 billion. This year, I just did this calculation because I was trying to make this understandable. This year, the federal budget authorized $575 million for the UPF, just for the design. That's $8 million a week to design this building. They're in the 5th year of designing it, and they're spending $8 million every week to design it. Next year, if they begin construction, they expect the cost to go up to over $500 million a year and to stay there for 10 years while they build the bomb plant. So, we can stop the insanity of nuclear weapons, we can stop the new arms race, but to do it we have to pay attention to something that we'd really rather not think about, which is the fact that we are always in constant risk of complete and total annihilation. Not only if some crazy or frightened leader pushes a button, but maybe just because a computer fails, or because a monitor reads a radar screen and misinterprets what he's seeing. These things have happened in our lifetimes since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall came down. We have had what are called near misses that have taken us within minutes of launching our nuclear missiles at Russia, and Russia has been in the same circumstance to launch with us. January 25th, 1995, a weather satellite was launched from Norway. Norway, following the protocol, had sent a warning message to Russia, but it got lost in the communication shuffle, and the Russian radar screens read it as a possible launch by NATO of a nuclear missile. Every alarm in the Kremlin went off. Brezhnev convened his cabinet, and what we learned when Bruce Blair, the Brookings Institute, looked at this years later, we learned that their protocol is the same as ours. When a launch happens, or we think it happens, one time radar misread the sun reflecting off of clouds as a launch of an entire fleet of nuclear weapons. When that happens, President Obama, or President Clinton, or President Trump, or Vladimir Putin, have 14 minutes to get their missiles off the ground. They have 10 minutes to decide. And in the Kremlin, the clock ticked down to 4 minutes, and Brezhnev just decided not to launch.
Thank you, Lord.
But everything that he was reading, everything that he saw, met his criteria for launching. Could have been different. So, I hope by now, if I've done my job well, I managed to present a really good advertisement for antidepressants. That's what I should have on the table in the back instead of our newsletter and our sign-up sheet and stuff like that. And Prozac and Wellbutrin and things. I want to spend the last couple of minutes before we have a conversation about the cure for what ails us. The first thing is very personal. Don't accept it. Don't accept the violence that surrounds us. Don't accept the received wisdom on nuclear weapons. Don't accept it. It's not okay to joke about snipers, so when you see a bumper sticker, it's okay to affirm that for yourself and even to mention it to the people you are with. You don't have to preach a sermon. You can just say, that makes me really uncomfortable. I read an interview once where an activist at a peace vigil was asked why they kept coming out there week after week to hold those signs, and the person said, "Don't you see, you're not ever going to change them?" And the woman said, "I don't come out here to change them. I come out here to keep them from changing me." So we have to take care of that same part of ourselves that rejects the violence. And the second thing is get active. I think to be bombarded day after day with headlines and videos, and then to come to a talk tonight about International Peace Week and to hear how wretched things are, all of it over and over again, can be overwhelming. So what can we do? And the answer is we can do something. We can write letters to the editor, we can share posts, we can retweet, we can educate ourselves enough that we can break the silence that surrounds us. And we can start conversation with friends or at church or temple or mosque, at school, at home, your book club, wherever you talk to people, at the coffee shop. We can find a local group that's working to create change. I'll bet you're part of one. If not, there are several offering themselves to you in this room right now. They're always looking for more people to help, so do something, whatever it is. And the third, don't do it alone. Aside from the fact that we are built and wired to live in relationship and function in the community, there's just the practical reality that this struggle will wear you down, and your commitment to nonviolence will be challenged most in your tensest and tiredest moments, and that's why we need to support each other and encourage each other and hold each other accountable. To work together as a team is a perfect example of nonviolence in action, what Gandhi called a miracle. You may find new interest in addressing nuclear weapons in religious communities. In the last year or so, there's been a little crack in the deep sleep that seems to have fallen over mainstream religious organizations about nuclear weapons. You know, back in the early 1980s, the nuclear freeze movement was at its height. Its main national office was in a church in New York City, and the backbone of the anti-nuclear weapons movement was in religious communities. And they galvanized religious communities to think about peace, and as soon as that began to happen, people actually thought about it and said, well, peace means a lot of things, not just nuclear weapons. It means family violence. It means taking care of the earth. And so, in a wonderful way, the churches and religious institutions were challenged to expand their definition of peace. But in a tough way for people working on nuclear weapons fell off the table altogether. They didn't just get moved to a little side of the plate. They got pushed off the table altogether. But that's beginning to change. In December of 2015, Pope Francis issued a very important statement from the Catholic Church, which I'm hoping Catholic communities around the country are going to be challenged to address and deal with. What it means to have your Pope say that nuclear weapons threaten the common good of which peace is the fullest expression, to remove the Catholic Church's provisional acceptance of the doctrine of deterrence, and basically completely and totally condemn nuclear weapons. It's an opportunity for a conversation to happen. And his stance has begun to inspire a little bit of interest in other congregations. I was asked by our local United Church of Christ congregation in Knoxville to help develop an online adult education course that they'll offer denomination-wide this coming year about nuclear weapons and the challenge for people of faith. So there are other glimmers too. Civil societies advancing an agenda over the objections of the United States of America, but other countries want to establish a ban on nuclear weapons that would have legal authority. And that's an effort that has grown out of an international series of meetings on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. So while we in our country were busy doing other things, people in other countries, some of whom are on the receiving end of our nuclear weapons, have actually felt more inspired to address this issue. Imagine that. And even the mainstream media, here and there, Eric Schlosser's movie is coming out, and CBS 60 Minutes is running that thing tonight. So I hope that there are opportunities for us to have this conversation, and I would say to you that when those opportunities arise, we have an obligation to raise our voices for peace and for nuclear disarmament. The fourth thing I would say is create. And when I came in here tonight, I see that at least some of you in here are already doing this, and it's wonderful to see the creativity around here. A few years ago, at one of our Sunday night vigils, we have a vigil at 5 o'clock every Sunday at the main entrance to Y12. We've been doing it for more than 16 years, never missed a Sunday. And one week the leader said, everybody imagine that you wake up tomorrow morning and the world is exactly the same as when you went to bed, except during the night, all nuclear weapons disappeared. And all weapons of every kind disappeared. War has been outlawed, and nations have disarmed. In that world, what are you going to do when you get up on Monday morning? So everybody thought for a while, and then we went around the circle, and someone said, I would write a song. And someone said, I'd paint a picture. Another person said, I'm going down to the craft co-op and throw mud. And so it went around the circle, and I realized that no matter what they actually did in their lives, we had administrators there, university professors, we had religious leaders, bookstore clerks, community organizers, a surveyor. Every single person described themselves on that amazing Monday morning getting up and engaging in a creative act. That's what peace looks like. If war is fundamentally a destructive act, then the opposite of war must be creating, which is peace. So practice by creating. And finally, fifth, celebrate. In some parts of the community, I know that some parts of the country, I know the progressive community is broad and deep. Progressives get elected in local elections. Preachers preach prophetic sermons without getting run out of town. But that's not always true in our part of the country. Southwest Virginia, East Tennessee. There are some things we have in common. Too often our circle is small. And the same people populate the peace and justice work in town. And it can really be exhausting and really hard to come by. So we have to celebrate them when they happen. From time to time, light breaks into the darkness. Maybe the Supreme Court ruling throws out the ban on gay marriage. But unless we pause to notice and to feel the light when it shines, it's just like a lightning flash in our lives. We can't sustain ourselves on glimpses of lightning every once in a while. So I think it's important, because too often we don't do this, to bask in the light a little bit when the light shines. Feel what goodness feels like. And when we do this, if we do it, and we do it right, people will be attracted to our work, to the community they see that has found joy. We need to laugh, even if it's dark humor. I remember I read an essay by Kurt Vonnegut about Biafra, and the African nation that literally starved to death. And he traveled there, and he was talking to one of their political military leaders, and the man made a joke. And Vonnegut turned to him and said, how can you make a joke under such dire conditions? And the man looked at him and said, what else can we do? Either we laugh or we die. So I think humor has the added virtue of being a great tool to use in our work, because it disarms, it can be honest. It sometimes reveals the absurdity of violence in all its many forms. It requires sensitivity, sure, but it also assures people. So levity. Bring levity to your work. And sing the glue that holds movements together. So in a moment, I want to see what kind of questions that has inspired from you. But first, You might notice that I'm a preacher. Did we mention that in the introduction? You probably caught on by now. So I want to practice what we preach. And these are the words to a little song that we wrote in Oak Ridge. If you'll pass those around. We wrote it for fun for a Sunday vigil, and after we sang it, people said, we ought to sing that more often. So now we've sung it at several of our events. It's called the UPF Ditty. And while it's going around, I'll tell you two things. One is I'm not a musician, so I'm going to prove that to you in just a minute. But the second thing is how this song came to be. There was an article on the front cover of Time magazine, maybe a year and a half ago. And it showed two women facing each other. One of the women lived in San Francisco and one of the women lived in New York City. And they both had brain cancer. They had gliomas, which are inoperable forms of brain cancer. And I was really interested in the article because one of my dear friends, who was a founder of the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance, a nurse in North Carolina, had just died from a glioma. She was 59 years old, way too young. And so I read this article, fascinated, and I came to a place in the article where they described this new therapy, a gene-based therapy for attacking these kind of gliomas, which are almost impossible because they form their own blood supply. Yeah. And what they were going to do was withdraw the genetic code from the tumor. They were going to decode it and then develop the antidote that would attack just that DNA. And they said, the government has authorized $217 million to develop this treatment this year, the National Institutes of Health. It said, of course, that's a drop in the bucket for what's required for us to develop this therapy and actually implement it to save lives. And they said, the woman from San Francisco is going to die from a brain tumor. And the woman in New York City was going to get into a trial program, and she had a chance to live. Well, in the meantime, one of my board members, a very good friend named Caroline Best, who happily is living right now, but wearing an experimental skull cap, developed a glioma. What I realized was the decision to only spend $217 million on developing treatment for this kind of brain cancer. We're spending $575 billion to design a bomb plant. That decision means some people will die of brain tumors. But even at that little amount of money, maybe in 10 or 12 years, we will have developed this therapy and it will work, and the people who get gliomas then will be cured. In the meantime, thousands of people will die because we made a different choice about how we were going to spend money on medical research. So that shows up in a verse in this song. It became the UPF Ditty. And I'm going to ask you, you can certainly, you'll see that this is not a complicated melody, so you can join in on the verses. But the choruses start with, yes, we'll build a new bomb plant. And that's the part that I hope that you all will join in with enthusiasm when we come to it. Pay attention, because I have a bad habit of changing the words of the chorus as you go through. And you'll see that I forget that, so I know how bad it is, but I still did it. But anyway, when we get to Yes, We Build a New Bomb Plant, it goes like this. Yes, we'll build a new bomb plant, no matter what the expense. But $6.5 billion, if it's all in the name of defense. Let me hear you try that. Yes, we'll build a new bomb plant, no matter what the expense. But $6.5 billion, if it's all in the name of defense. That's good. Be ready. You say you have no health insurance. questions or comments or conversation that you might want to have. I don't know, how long do we want to,
Can we go 10 minutes?
10 minutes or so? I mean, if you have to go,
See what
you
happens.
go.
Yeah, you can walk out and stay and leave. We've got a question right over here.
So there's a gentleman named, it might take me a second to come up with his name, but he worked as a nuclear scientist working with the nuclear program, and then he became an activist. He quit that profession and he became Will Keepin is his name, and he wrote they began doing peace activist work, environmental work, and they realized that there was a lot of discord between the men and the women, and that was a fundamental area that needed to be addressed. So he created an organization and a book called Divine Duality, and they do workshops around the world using the breathing techniques of holotropic breath work as part of it. And what they do is they bring men and women together to really open up the deep wounds between men and women and help them to resolve that, because it's very interesting when you look at the nuclear issue. It goes back to the ideas in Hinduism expressed by Shiva and Shakti, and Shiva also has this persona as the destroyer. So you have the creator and you have the destroyer, the yin and the yang, the dark and the light, the duality. So I've often thought that the healing is the core and fundamental piece within, that's like even deeper than the activism, that it starts with that place where it lives deep in our DNA and in our own deeper internal dynamic.
So, and what you mentioned is a great resource. I'll tell you how I first became interested in nuclear weapons. I went to a Presbyterian peacemaking conference in Montreat, North Carolina, and I went to sell T-shirts because our local Knoxville Committee on Central America group had some people arrested, including me, at a sit-in in Al Gore's office, and we were trying to raise money for the Legal Defense Fund. So we silk-screened a bunch of T-shirts that said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and they had Gandhi and King and Mother Teresa on them, I think. And we took them over to the peacemaking conference, and we kind of just showed up there we figured a bunch of Presbyterians we could hawk them. I was a Presbyterian minister at the time. And I noticed on the agenda that this guy named Howard Kleinbell was leading a workshop called Despair and Personal Power in the Nuclear Age. And I was interested because Howard Kleinbell wrote my textbook on counseling in seminary, and I thought, I'm going to go see what Kleinbell looks like. That's all I thought. I didn't think, what an interesting topic. I thought, I wonder what that guy looks like. So I went. And what you said reminded me of this, because the workshop that he did was based on the work of Joanna Rogers Macy, who applies the principles of Buddhism. And the book that she had written then, in the 1980s, was called Despair and Personal Power in the Nuclear Age. And it's filled with exercises. We use it in our nonviolence training still. She's done several other books since then, all on the same theme of recognizing the web of life and connecting at this deep spiritual level to what it is that makes us human, makes us alive, and stuff like that. Kleinbell said, you may wonder why this is not my field. Why am I doing these workshops? And he said, I'm doing these workshops because my son, who was 11 years old, we were riding down the street listening to Morning Edition on Saturday morning, and there was a story about nuclear weapons, and my son said to me, Dad, will there still be a world when I grow up? And he said, I realized I could not promise my son there would be. And I pulled the car off the side of the road and began to cry, and decided for the next 3 years I'm going to devote myself to addressing the question of the nuclear threat. And that has stuck with me. Here I am 40-some years later, remembering what Howard Kleinbell said that day. And I think that is, when I look around the room here, with only a couple of exceptions, a lot of people look sort of close to my generation. And I would say we should take seriously our responsibility for the world that we're leaving to future generations. And rather than thinking, well, we put in a good slog and we're tired and it's time to retire, I think we should say, this is the time when we can let it all out. We need to do whatever we can, because we literally, we may think we have an obligation to ourselves to enjoy the rest of our life or something. What we have an obligation to is the sacred circle of life and the world that we're leaving to the next generation. And that's our primary obligation, and it should inform us. It should be an imperative in our lives. So I'll just thank you for the chance to say that. But to say there are a lot of resources, and they do reach into spiritual realms, particularly Eastern religions, I think, that maybe help us break out of the mold that we grew up in, to look in a different way.
And a burning question, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Ben.
Okay. Just trying to get some video. Could you talk a little about the connections between the nuclear power industry and the nuclear weapons industry? Because there have been a lot of close call or near misses or whatever. Like I read about a nuclear power plant in northern Alabama back in the 70s, I think, that, you know, all the fail-safe systems failed and they were like, they give up, they're like, the thing's gonna melt down, we're all screwed. And then the local fire department, you know, said, well, we'll go in there and try. And I guess they put out some of the fire, and just by a hair we missed, you know, this huge Fukushima-like thing happening here.
Well, so, and if you, when Eric Schlosser's Command and Control comes on television, you'll see the same, almost the exact same story happening in a missile silo in North or South Dakota, I forget which. So I would say a couple of things. One is I don't work on nuclear power issues much for several reasons. Primary of which is I can't do half of what I should do on nuclear weapons. But the government has constructed the nuclear power industry, civilian nuclear power and military nuclear power, is totally separate beasts, different bureaucracies, different ways for the public to participate. So I know there's such a thing as intervening in an NRC licensing. I have no idea what that's about. But I can talk to you for hours about how you engage in an NEPA process for the Department of Energy, right? So I do this and I don't do that much at all. Here's where they overlap. The risks and the threats are very similar. The fact that as long as we have a market for nuclear materials, fissile materials like uranium, whether it's highly enriched for weapons or whether it's low enriched for nuclear reactors, as long as we have those markets, then we have the potential for nuclear terrorism. So there's that. There's also the waste issue, which is one of the ways in which the government's attempt to separate civilian and military nuclear power has in the last 15 years broken down, because both sides have intractable waste issues. They can't find one place to take any kind of waste, let alone two places for the separate different kinds of waste. So that's one of the things that's brought the nuclear power and the nuclear weapons communities together for conversations is what about the waste that's on the tail end of all of these things. So there are all of those challenges, I think, that are similarities. I think it's a hard, because I see it from my end, I understand completely. I think it's a hard truth that the two communities don't work together very often. We collaborate whenever we can and we have good relations, but I totally understand the nuclear power people saying, I can't even get in that world because I can't do half of what I need to do here, because that's exactly how I feel as well. But I do think for the broader vision, yes, these are all threats, and they impact us. In Oak Ridge, we have a national lab that doesn't do weapons work. It does supercomputing, it does nuclear research, it has an operating power reactor, and I spent several days late last year, no, I guess it was early this year, talking about the fuel coming from North Anna reactor here in Virginia to Oak Ridge National Lab as part of a new research. I went to some hearings on the radioactive waste task force held in Knoxville, Tennessee because of this, and I was astonished to find out that 20 years ago, the nuclear industry agreed to change the way they fuel their reactors to use what they call high burn-up fuel. In other words, leave the fuel in longer to get more power out of it, but at the same time, when it comes out, it's a different kind of waste than what they had planned for originally. And 20 years later, they're trying to figure out what exactly is high burn-up fuel going to present to us? What challenges do we have that are different? And they don't know, other than, I mean, they're looking at it at the microgram level. I saw slides up there of the cladding where you could see, hairline fractures look this big. That's how detailed they're doing some great work trying to understand it. they're 20 years too late because they gave it the go-ahead. They've been doing it for years without knowing what they were going to do at the tail end, not even knowing what they were going to have to deal with.
I wonder if the power of nuclear, the criminal insanity of nuclear powers, which has always been the case, well known for a long time, is not primarily for culture control. It puts us in a state of perpetual conflict, like most things with politics these days, and we get so deceived by the conflict that we forget what we should be doing, building local communities, decolonizing, respecting local sovereignty, and so forth. And we are totally distracted. We maybe have to, where else could this power be coming from if we were not to control the culture?
Yeah.
This $15 billion drop in the bucket, trillions of dollars have done this. So we have to get wise enough.
Well, and yeah, that's been the tool that's been used. I mean, I've been reading about the last great steel strike because my dad worked in the Youngstown Sheet and Tube in 1937. It was that. I mean, it's been the labor union struggle all along. The attempt to pit people against each other so that they're distracted from addressing the... And I think the other thing that I would say in response, Ben, to partially what you said was, the other thing that connects it is money. It's money. There are, big money to be had from nuclear power. We have, my Senator Lamar Alexander just had an op-ed in the Knoxville paper in the last month saying, we need to cut the $2 billion subsidy for wind power and start working on small modular reactors. Now, there's no industry that has been more subsidized by the government than the nuclear power industry. And here's Lamar Alexander saying, we can't afford wind power, this little pittance for wind power, because we want to build small modular reactors and we need to give the money for that. So I've often said to people, I didn't have it in the show tonight, but with nuclear weapons, you see all these military guys coming out saying nuclear weapons make us less secure, not more secure. I mean, these are not doves. These were Hawks, the head of Strategic Air Command, who says we don't buy in security with this. The reality is it's the money that drives this. It's not military necessity. It's not a political necessity. It's the money that's keeping this program going. Last question, I think, because we're going to run out.
Yeah, I just had an anecdote. When I was younger, I thought, like physicists and politicians, whatever, knew what they were doing. I realized they weren't perfect, but, they kind of knew what they were doing. I met one of the physicists who was at the first H-bomb test out in the Pacific, and he said that when the thing was just about to go off, he realized they really didn't know what it was going to do. He said, he turned to this other physicist and said, what if this ignites the atmosphere of the whole world? And the other physicist just turned and looked at him and didn't say anything. And at that moment I realized, well, I guess these guys don't know what they're doing.
So at the Trinity test in Alamogordo, New Mexico, the first nuclear explosion, the physicists had a betting pool on whether or not the atmosphere would ignite.
Yeah, well, this is what this guy said at the first H-bomb test. They weren't sure if the whole atmosphere was going to go up.
As a sidebar, 25 years ago at our office in Knoxville, we got a magazine put out by the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, a quarterly magazine called the ORNL Review, and it had some anniversary of nuclear power, or the lab, and so they had an article by Alvin Weinberg, who is known as the father of nuclear power in this country. He'd been the lab director for decades. And what struck me about it was there was a little pull quote on the side of one of the articles where he said, if I had known 30 years ago that we still would not have solved the problem of nuclear waste, I might have had second thoughts about nuclear power. This was the father of nuclear power in this country making this admission. I met Weinberg, talked with him about nuclear weapons and stuff. He was an honest guy. We didn't always see eye to eye. He wanted the United States to establish a religious taboo against the use of nuclear weapons. He had a meeting that I went to. We had a long conversation about it, and I pointed out that, to make it like a sacrament, I said, well, then go talk to Hiroshima, because it's the Jews that established Passover as a sacrament, not the Egyptians. It's the Japanese that would have to establish Hiroshima as a sacrament, not the Americans. But this was Weinberg saying, they truly thought they would master it all back. I mean, they had split the atom. They had Enrico Fermi had with his slide rule correctly calculated each layer of bricks they put on the pile at Stagg Stadium in the University of Chicago, and they never knew if it was going to run away and destroy them. They had a guy up at the top with an axe and a boron rod, the last line of defense. It was his suicide mission. If the thing went crazy, they would all die, but he was going to save Chicago by cutting the rope and dropping the spoiler rod down in the middle of the pile, right? But at each level, Fermi would calculate with his slide rule and say it'll go this high and no higher. And he was right, he was right, he was right. It achieved criticality and it didn't run away. It sustained. So they thought, whatever the challenges are, we are going to be able to do it. You know, it was an honest optimism, I think. It just happened to be wrong. At least 70 years later, it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, we really want to thank donating a little bit in the basket, and Ralph traveled a long way to get here with us. I also wanted to mention before Katie left that there may be other people in the room as well, but I'd like to acknowledge Katie Zawacki and some of the work that she and John have done in Roanoke, not only between the voices of faith and recognizing how we can learn and strengthen the community by sharing our differences in our faith and heritage and cultural backgrounds, but also in how to take the next steps in forming circles of communication in the community. So the Points of Diversity study circles are open for signing up. So you want to say more
Just
about
to
that?
describe them a little bit more, and Polly's been one of our greatest advocates. Study circles have been around for a long, long time in this country and across the world. It's a way to bring people together with different points of view from different cultures to talk respectfully. And yes, we can do that, and we can differ, and we can still disagree about some things, but there's always some common ground. So they're very structured meetings. The study circles we're going to run are 4 sessions, so 4 weeks in a row for 2 hours each time, and we are signing people up, and we really would like to have people who want to talk to someone, learn something from somebody else, and share what they believe. Joan has been through the facilitator training too, so we have about 15 people who have been trained as facilitators, and we're ready to continue the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. I might also add that this week also, Donna Tuning is going to be training restorative justice facilitators. So in a similar light, people that will be able to facilitate not just dispute mediation, but a process for communicating and breaking through, getting to those emotional levels as to why there is a conflict at whatever type of level of conflict for the community. So that's an ongoing process that we really hope to have Roanoke filled with facilitators to meet the needs within different communities of the valley and the area. Anyone else?
I left a few resources back on that table. Please go by there on your way out. You can sign up for our mailing list or get a fact sheet or a newsletter or some of the other pieces about nonviolence. Help yourself.
Excellent.
The less I take back to Knoxville, the happier I am.
Excellent. Anybody else want to pipe out
I have a resource if Ralph or anyone in our area wants to work with it. A guy named Joe Weston, who came back to the United States after spending time in Scandinavia, has created a work called Respectful Confrontation. So it teaches people to be in confrontation in a way that's respectful, but not to avoid confrontation.
Is he here in Roanoke?
He's actually in Washington, D.C. Joe Weston, Respectful Confrontation.
I'll look that